Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Must Read TV, the Skylark Bookshop Virtual Author Series. My name is Alex George, and I'm the owner of Skylark, which is an independent bookstore in downtown Columbia, Missouri, not Columbia, Maryland, as we quite often are told when people try and get hold of us. Tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome to Skylark Dolores Johnson to discuss her memoir, Say I'm Dead. Say I'm Dead has received a starred review from the American Library Association and won the 2020 Outstanding Literary Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. Dolores has published essays on mixed race, racism, and identity in Narratively, The Buffalo News, Hippocampus, Lunch Ticket, and others. She has consulted on diversity with colleges, corporations, and non-profit boards. She holds a BA from Howard University, an MBA from Harvard Business School, and completed an MFA equivalent creative writing program. A former business executive, she also oversaw the digitization of John F. Kennedy's papers at his presidential library. This evening, Dolores will be in conversation with Calvin Hennick, whose debut memoir, Once More to the Rodeo, received the Pushcart Press Editors Book Award. A journalist by training, he has written for dozens of publications, including the Boston Globe, Esquire, and Runner's World, and has published fiction and essays in outlets including Bellevue Literary Review, Baltimore Review, and The Drum. He lives outside of Boston with his wife and two young children. Dolores and Calvin will be in conversation for, depending upon how we go, somewhere between 40-50 minutes. If you have any questions or comments, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and Calvin will get to them towards the end of their conversation. If you enjoy this evening's talk, and I know that you will, please consider helping us out and buying a copy of Say I'm Dead from Skylark. To reserve your copies, you can either give us a call at 573-777-6990, or you can drop us a line at mail@skylarkbookshop.com, or you can go to our e-commerce website, and the book is right there in the middle of the front page. Very easy to buy should you wish to do so. All right, enough of me. I will disappear off the screen and I will leave Calvin and Dolores to it. Enjoy your conversation. I will see you again at the end.
Thanks, Alex. And don't just buy Dolores's book at Skylark, buy all your Christmas presents at Skylark, because it's an independent bookstore. And I haven't been there, but I'm sure it's wonderful, because I don't think I've ever been to an independent bookstore that isn't wonderful. They're treasures, and so we should all support those. But Dolores, before we jump into the Q&A, I wondered if you had a little snippet that you wanted to read for us.
Thanks, Calvin. Yes, I will. And thanks to Skylark Bookshop for having us tonight. This snippet is called Looking. New in town and recently divorced, Charles headed out to Madam C.J. Walker's ballroom in 1942, the place for Indianapolis Negroes to mingle. On a mission to find a nice colored girl to start over with, to marry, he adjusted his tie before following the music upstairs. There he found a tuxedoed band perched on a roulette wheel bandstand, shimmying out the foxtrot couples danced to. He took in the scene from the bar, his eyes flitting from one attractive girl in a fancy dress to another. As he sipped a too expensive shot of bourbon, another fellow eyed his broad shoulders and shined but warmed shoes before coming over. See something you like? Yeah, plenty, Charles said. Look at here, Jack. The man said, meeting a girl at Walker's depends on how much you got in your pocket and who your daddy is, see? And if she ain't happy with both, all you're going to get is one dance, if you're lucky. Charles watched smooth-talking men in stylish suits lead those women onto the dance floor, realizing he couldn't make any time there. So he stayed a while for the jazz and watched the well-to-do spectacle before taking a lonely stroll back to his boarding house. Where was there for a colored man to find a suitable Negro girl? One who was nothing like the wife he had down in Georgia, the one he had to marry at 17, who said the baby was his, and later that it wasn't. The girl he wanted wasn't in the churches he'd tried, just old ladies married women and not very attractive singles. And the mother of the one he had approached snatched her away because he was divorced. The girl he was looking for wasn't out Indiana Avenue at the Sunset Terrace either, where the brown sugar went to dance. They were good looking, all right, sporting outfits that clung to their charms with jaunty hats tipped over done-up hair. The ones he talked to sure enough looked like sugar, but their salty invitations tasted too much like his past. On his walk back home, that ladylike girl in the mailroom at work ran through his mind, like always. The white girl with guts enough to talk to him like a straight-up man, the one whose soft skin he imagined touching, even though the Klan would string up his damn fool self for looking at her, the way they did those two boys a few years ago. But damn if she wasn't the sweetest woman he had ever met. The day did come when Charles snuck down to the mailroom and whispered what he'd practiced in his mirror. "I hope I'm not out of line," he said, "but I want you to know that I like you very much." She stared at him, tilted her head, and weighed his words carefully. "I've thought of you too," she said. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Dolores. I'm muting myself when I'm not talking because my wife is doing bedtime and behind me. So we'll see if we get any background noise. That was fantastic. I'm great to hear that again. I'm so impressed by your ability to put yourself inside the heads of people in your lives to inhabit that space in a literary way. It's just fantastic. Dolores's book is one of my favorites that I read this year, so I'm really excited to be here talking to her about her amazing story and her amazing book. And that really is a great kickoff actually for my first question, which is about how your Black father and white mother fell in love in 1943 Indiana, at a time and place when anti-miscegenation laws made their relationship illegal. Can you talk a little bit about how the relationship unfolded and what they were up against if they got, caught?
Sure. Well, they met at work. My mom was the mail clerk and my dad was the handyman who was sent down to the mail office to build some shelves. And neither one of my parents had ever really known or had a friendship with somebody from the other race. But they regarded each other with a common decency and humanity, which led them to become more friendly. And after a while, my father asked her for a date, as I just read. So they were up against a lot of hostile environment in Indianapolis in 1942. The Klan was running the city council. There had been a governor of Indiana who was the grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, running the entire nationwide organization from Indianapolis. And that culture had permeated a lot of society. In fact, there had been a lynching of two men outside of Indianapolis not too long before my parents took up. And these two men had been accused of a robbery, and a white woman said that they had raped her. And a mob broke into the jail with sledgehammers and drug these men out and hung them. In the book, you'll see the photograph from the Indiana Historical Society of the two men hanging from the tree and this sort of festival picnic kind of atmosphere of the crowd underneath the hanging bodies. And so in addition to all of that, it was against the law in Indiana to intermarry, punishable by 7 years in prison for both the man and the woman. And so if they wanted to be together, my parents knew that they had to flee.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I actually learned a lot reading your book. I obviously knew about the historical legacy of lynchings, but I didn't realize that people had broken in with sledgehammers into jail. So that was what was happening at the time, which I guess I had never thought through the logistics, but just it was harrowing and illuminating to read about. your mother at the time was almost sort of sweetly naive, I think, about the dynamics of race, the way that you write about it in the book. Sort of one quote from the book is that Negro business wasn't their business, in terms of her family. Can you talk a little bit about sort of her, knowledge or experience or lack thereof, and how that sort of relates to white people's experience of race today, even?
Sure. I heard my mother explain that phrase, Negro business wasn't our business, by saying that she lived in something like a cocoon. She lived in a white Catholic community, and that was their social circle. That was their parish where everybody hung out. They had dinner and they had acting classes and put on plays, and all the people in the community were white. So she had no understanding of Black people. My dad, of course, also lived in a segregated environment and didn't know that much about white people, although he had worked for white people in various jobs. He'd never had a personal relationship with a white person. But my mom said that her family never talked politics. They didn't talk about race. And they just didn't see what was going on the other side of the racial divide. And I think that we heard that this summer during the race protests in America. Lots of white allies were stepping forward and saying, I see how harsh and terrible the systemic racism can be. How can I help? What can I do? And the conversations revealed that there was sort of a mystery around the life that Black people live. Sort of the same separation and cocooning that happened when my parents met in the 40s is still going on today in the United States. And I believe that that is a outgrowth of our segregated housing.
Sure.
Because we don't live together, we don't know each other, we never talk over the fence or go, to the school parent meetings together, because the schools are also segregated. And so we have a lot of work to do if we're going to know each other and have a unified effort around racial justice.
Yeah, I think one of the bright points of social media, and there are plenty of things to say against social media, but one thing is that people who haven't historically had their stories told by the mainstream media have been able to sort of say, here's what my life looks like, here's my interaction with the police on video. And certainly there are some people who, for them, even seeing it in their faces is not enough, and they find ways to explain things away. But I think a lot of people have had their eyes opened because they've been able to see other people's lives in a way they weren't before.
And I think that's also a great thing about having more and more writers of color, where they can tell these authentic stories from the point of view of the people of color, rather than through the lens of people who don't really understand systemic racism and haven't experienced it themselves.
Well, that was one of the fantastic things I thought about your book, because a lot of stuff in the book are things that I'd read about in history books, but hadn't, talked to people who had lived through a lot of those experiences. And you go back in your book to, well before even your parents' generation, where I forget whether it was your grandmother, I think, who was the product of plantation rape. Is that right?
That is right. And I discovered that in doing my father's genealogy. I was on a roots mission and I went down south to meet this ancient old aunt. And she's the one who told me. I was an adult when I found out that my great-grandmother had been raped repeatedly by a white man on a plantation, and that my grandmother was also half white. Nobody had ever told me that, had never been spoken of. And my grandmother was in our house all the time. She helped raise us after school and all of that. And I asked my great aunt, well, my grandmother didn't tell me that because she must have been ashamed. And she said, what do you mean ashamed? That's what white men have always done to Black women, and there was nothing that they could do about it. She didn't do anything wrong, and she had no shame about it, and shouldn't have.
Yeah. No, that's, yeah. Your parents didn't stay in Indiana because they felt like they couldn't, and that they fled in secret to New York State, not even telling your mother's family that she was leaving, and disappeared for 36 years. Can you talk a little bit about their move there, and then also some of the different types and forms of racism that you and your family experienced from both Black and white people when you were in the Buffalo area?
Sure. Well, my mother staged her own disappearance, and the FBI couldn't even find her, but she was there with my dad, married in Buffalo,
Good.
and raising 3 kids. And our family was very, very different from everybody around us because mixed race was not a thing in the 40s and 50s. And people from all sides had a problem with us. So there was racism that my dad especially encountered at his job, where he was discriminated against in job title and pay, and also subjected to all kinds of insulting remarks. And we kids, because we lived in the ghetto and our birth certificates said we were Negro, my mom's white blood being totally discounted in the government records. We also went to ghetto schools and had substandard education and poor housing, rental, poor health care, all of the kind of things that people talk about in racism today. But on top of that, we had a double whammy racism, which was because we were mixed race. Mm-hmm. And when I was 10 years old, in 1958, Pew Research did a national survey that showed that 96% of Americans were against mixed race.
What year was that? I'm sorry?
1958.
Okay.
My parents had been married 15 years and we were raised in an atmosphere where people would cross the street or shoo their children in a corner so they wouldn't touch us, say all kinds of ugly things, spit on the ground at us. And there were incidents where people were so horrified just at the sight of us as a mixed race family. I'll give you an example. We went on a summer picnic at a county park, and my oldest brother was down in a ravine doing a little hike, and he got into a hornet's nest. And when he got back to the campsite, he was covered in stingers and screaming bloody murder. He's rolling all over the ground. And my mom came over and tried to pull the stingers out, and she was having very little success. A white woman walks by, she's on her way to the facilities, and she comes over and very graciously offers to help. And she starts making mud pies with water and dirt. And when she packs the stingers, they come right out like a toothpick out of a fresh cake. And pretty soon my brother is okay. She's saved the day. And my mom invites her to lunch and she says, no, thanks. And my dad comes out from the shed where he'd been barbecuing. And when he puts his arm around my brother, the woman looks from my mother to my father to my brother, and her hand flies up over her mouth, and she ran off like the hornets were after her. She just, was completely horrified. But, racism cuts both ways. And there was another incident where the shoe was on the other foot. My parents heard that there was going to be a Black convention held in Buffalo. Of course, the conventioneers were not going to be allowed to stay at the hotels. And so the call went out to the community, the Black community, to house these conventioneers, give them room and board, and they would be paid a sum of money. And my parents signed up. And my mother went all out cooking and cleaning and moving furniture and everything to accommodate the visitors. And when they came, it was a Black couple that was going to this religious convention. And they come into the living room, and my dad calls my mom out from the kitchen where she's in there making this nice hot supper for them. And when she arrives in the living room, the Black woman says, well, who is this? And my father says, this is my wife, Ella. And she says, your wife? This woman is your wife? And she puts her hands on her hips and shakes her head violently. And she said, somebody should have told us about this. We can't stay here with this N-word and this white trash and look at them and on our vacation. So she tells her husband, get the suitcase, and they stomp out. And so we got a racial backlash from everybody.
Wow. Yeah. For people watching, I'm in an interracial marriage myself and have two young biracial children. And my memoir, Once More to the Rodeo, which is right behind me, describes me taking a road trip with my young son back to my small hometown in Iowa. But I've told Dolores this before, but her parents are real, heroes to me and pioneers, because my life is so much more possible and just, livable, because people like her parents, put it all out on the line and really dealt with a lot of stuff that my family, fortunately, mostly has not had to deal with. So I'm really grateful for that. But speaking of that, can you talk a little bit about how it affected you and your family when the Supreme Court handed down Loving v. Virginia? Because, my whole life and certainly my marriage has taken place in the shadow of that law and, or that ruling rather. And we've never had to worry about the legality of, of our relationship. But what was that like for you? Because your parents have been married many years when Loving was passed down.
Yeah, they had been married just about 25 years already. The Supreme Court took up a case of a couple who coincidentally had a last name of Loving, a white man and a Black woman who married in the District of Columbia and then went into Virginia to live, which is where they were from. They had crossed the line because the mixed race marriage was illegal in Virginia. But they sued at the Supreme Court. And that decision in 1967 overturned the remaining 16 states in the United States that still had statutes on the books that forbid interracial marriage and punishment by prison time. Now, I found that out when I was in college. I was 19 years old, and one of my classmates congratulated me because the Supreme Court had now made it possible for me not to be a bastard. That was his word. And I didn't think this applied to me or my family because my parents had been married legitimately in New York State.
Mm-hmm.
But years later, as I started to unfold the history of my family, I found out it had everything to do with us. But I asked my mom many years later, why didn't you go home to your family after the Loving decision was passed? And she said, I wanted to leave sleeping dogs lie. I didn't think I could just show up with my family with this Black man and these 3 mixed children. I didn't think they would accept it. I didn't think it would work out. And why stir that up? I had closed the door on that life and I just went on without looking back. But I have to say, Calvin, my parents did not consider themselves pioneers. They were not out to make a statement or anything. They just were in love and wanted to be together. But I think they would be some kind of proud to hear what you said about how it's affected your family's life.
Yeah, your mother's fear of what her family would think is a great source of tension in the story, and then there's a lot of difficult conversations that you had to have with your mom about wanting to seek out the family and sort of you grew up not knowing anything of her family, right? Can you talk a little bit about why it was so important for you to go on this journey of discovery of the white side of your family?
Well, I had been raised as a Black person, and I had gone to Howard University, which put the stamp of racial justice on me. And I was living my life as a Black person, but working in corporate America.
Yeah.
And the need to code switch and wear a mask at work to kind of subdue my natural speech and mannerisms and ways of even standing or laughing was all part of the price of getting into corporate America and being accepted or acceptable to the 99% white workforce. And I found that going back and forth between my Black weekends and my white work days was really tearing me apart. And I wanted to be more rooted in my heritage and balanced in my soul. And so it was really important for me, once I found out my mother's secret, that she had run away and been missing for 36 years, I felt my identity tilt. Like her whiteness had been negated in my life all those years, my whole life, all the time. And now I find out that there's actually another branch on my tree with a lot of people. I don't know what they're like. I don't know what they look like. I don't know anything about them, but now all of a sudden I have to know so that I know who I am.
Yeah. You mentioned Howard. You were at Howard and then you went to Harvard Business School afterwards. So two very different institutions. How did your experience at Howard shape your identity and perspective on race?
When I arrived at Howard, the president welcomed the freshman class by telling us that we had been admitted not just to get our own education, but to raise the Negro race. That is, yeah, we were charged with taking what we learned at Howard and making the most of ourselves and reaching back and pulling up people behind us. And W.E.B. Du Bois is a famous thought leader on racial matters who had written that there's a talented 10th in the Black race. And that's what the president of Howard told us we were, the talented 10th of the race. And that it was up to us to make sure that progress was made for Black Americans. As a matter of fact, at Howard, we had the entire Black diaspora. We had 20% of the student body was from overseas. So many, many Africans, people from the Caribbean, Pakistanis, Indians, Black Canadians, we were all there together in unity, understanding our identity and our purpose in life together.
That's great. Going back to your career for a minute, although this presents itself not just in your career, but in your daily life, there was a moment when you were at a management dinner and a white woman said something disparaging about Black people, and your boss made the woman apologize after you complained about it. But, her excuse was, I wouldn't have said it if I knew you were Black. And you've been on the receiving end of lots of those sort of, I wouldn't have said it if I knew you were Black types of comments in your life, because not everyone recognizes your Black identity when they, just by sight. I'm curious what it's been like to sort of inhabit another world sometimes and sort of, be viewed, have people talk to you as though they, thinking that you're a white woman and feeling maybe more free to say what is really on their mind.
Well, it's eye-opening, I'll tell you that. Yeah. When Black people meet white people or deal with white people, there's always this sort of warning sound going off that you have to be careful that they may not really mean what they say, or they may not really want to work with you or live next to you or whatever. And that notion was amplified by a number of situations where white people have said things to me like that woman did. I wouldn't have said it if I'd known you were Black. No. Meaning, we talk about Black people badly all the time among ourselves, white people. No. And of course, we wouldn't do that in front of you for you to hear it. So this kind of casual racism still goes on today. I still encounter it. I've had people in the grocery store line comment on a Black person who's up at the cash register having some sort of difficulty with their order, making disparaging remarks. And it's so commonplace that the expectation among white people seems to be, if I say this, whoever I'm talking to is not going to object to it. It's going to be perfectly okay for me to say these things. And so when I meet white people who want to be allies in the march of social justice, I always tell them it would be so helpful if you would call those things out. And maybe people don't even realize that they're doing something wrong, but let them know that that's not acceptable. I mean,
Yeah, no.
I've heard
Right.
way too much of it.
Yeah, it was surprising when you told me that, because I obviously am a white person. White people, presumably, unless they see me with my family, feel the same sort of comfort, saying whatever to me. And I certainly don't in my regular life socialize with anyone who would, just casually make racist remarks. But when someone does casually drop something like that, it just hits me like a ton of bricks. I was at a garage sale one time, and the man was selling like a little billy club thing, and I picked it up and looked at it. And he said, "Oh yeah, we call that a Roxbury N-word beater." And I was just, what the, how do you think it's, and I was so stunned that I was there with my friend. I was like, "We're leaving." And then I left, and it was like, an 80-year-old man. And I even so, I would, if I had taken one step to think about it, I would have laid into him for thinking he could talk like that. But it's jarring for me to hear those types of comments. So I can only imagine for you.
It is. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. So you and your husband moved to Baton Rouge for work after all of this, and your father had warned you about the Deep South, but you faced some pretty serious racist events there. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like living in that part of the country at that time?
We moved down there in the 70s and thought, because the civil rights bills had been passed a decade prior, that everything was fine.
Yeah.
But, I was 26 and I didn't know that changing the law doesn't change people's hearts.
Yeah.
So we went, even though my father told us we had no idea what we were doing. And he turned out to be right, because the racism in Baton Rouge was far more than anything I could have imagined.
Yeah.
So at my job, a man who was purported to be in the Klan came by my desk to tell me N-word jokes.
Was this who knew you were Black, or who presumed you were?
Yeah,
Okay.
because actually I went there in a management position, and I found out much later that on the Friday before my first day of work, which was Monday, there had been a office-wide meeting where they announced that a new manager was coming on Monday that was Black. And I was the first one in the state of Louisiana. And they didn't want anybody to be surprised when I showed up. So, but I also had an employee I was 26 and he was in his 50s. Mm-hmm. And he was born and bred in Baton Rouge and also rumored to be in the Klan. And he reported to me, which he could not tolerate. So, he did everything he could to sabotage me and to turn people against me and refuse to work with me. And we went out to call on some clients one day in the company car, and he was driving. And he was so angry that I was out there because I had to write his review, observing his sales techniques and everything.
Sure.
After we left the customer, he drove the car up a dirt road way beyond where anybody could see it, turned off the engine, and turned around and glared at me. And he held my gaze so hard and so long, I thought I was going to die that day. But I tried to hold his gaze and look like I wasn't scared, although I was thinking, how am I going to jump out of this car? But beyond that, beyond the discomfort of this kind of behavior that I had to work with, after we bought our house, we had some new furniture delivered, and we were so pleased with ourselves. It was our first house, and we were sitting on our new sofa one evening, the first few days we were there, and there was a banging on the front door. And my husband went to the door, and there was a cross burning on the lawn. So we weren't welcome. But I ran in and called 911, and they came out, and the policeman fanned out in the neighborhood to see if they could find the perpetrators. And when the leader of the group, we don't know his name or his title, because he never introduced himself or gave us a card or a phone number or anything.
Mm-hmm.
He came in and told us to sit down and said, well, you must be some good Negroes because nobody wants to make a complaint against you. So I'm looking at my husband and getting ready to say something. And he's just like shaking his head like, no, don't say anything. So when I see all of the protests around how the police treat Black people, I understand it completely.
Mm-hmm.
We had our lives threatened and the police didn't care at all.
Yeah.
They didn't help us. They didn't find anybody. They didn't look for anybody. And when people came back and continued to harass us and threaten us, they would say, oh, we can't come now because there's a football game in town. The roads are all clogged up. Or we can't come now because the deed has been done. We can't catch them because they're gone. I mean, absolutely zero help. So yeah, we got out of Baton Rouge as soon as we possibly could.
Have you felt, as time has progressed and as you've lived in different parts of the country, that you've been able to depend on institutions to be on your side or more on your side than that? Or do you always sort of feel like you have to kind of at least, question whether, you're going to be treated the same way as I would be treated if I were to call the police in the same town?
Well, I think I'm always questioning.
Yeah.
Even though, I'm well educated and was well employed,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm, middle class, I don't feel, and I'm light skinned, which gives me some advantages over many Black people, because that's another thing about being light. White people receive me better than they do dark people. There's something of affinity maybe that I look closer to their family members or themselves, and I speak more like they do, and so that makes me somehow more acceptable.
Have you been in situations where you're with darker skinned women and you're each treated differently, or does that come out of conversations with women who have darker skin?
Well, no, I think it's just obvious to me in the circles that I am able to move in.
Yeah.
That happens, but here's an example. I mean, most of the world is color struck. Wherever there have been Western colonizers, they've imposed a standard of beauty around whiteness,
Mm-hmm.
a standard of intelligence and worth around whiteness.
Yeah.
And so people who are dark in India and Japan, even in Ghana, in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, everywhere, are treated as less than white people. But there's always this striving to be closer to whiteness in order to be more acceptable. I've even had a very dark man propose to me, explaining that if we got married, I could help him bleach his children so they would have a better chance in life.
Yeah, I mean, that's such internalized racism, and it's really sad and upsetting to hear. My wife is from Haiti. She's very dark skinned and has black hair.
And a lovely lady, I must say.
She's a very lovely lady. But yeah, she's from Haiti, and there she says that there's not a formalized caste system or anything, but people with more French blood and therefore lighter skin are usually sort of have a higher social or socioeconomic standing than darker skinned people there even. And so yeah, it's
worldwide. It's
yeah,
worldwide.
Sure. Speaking of sort of progress, you talk about in your book about, you do a thing where you talk about the generations back on the white side of your family and the generations back on the black side of your family, and sort of what economic situation each generation was in. Did you want to read that little passage, or do you have it in front of you?
I would like to, yeah.
Sure, yeah.
So after my discovery of my white family, just long story short, I was able to go search for my white family and find them. And after we had become reunited as a family, I began to look into the genealogy of my white family, just as I had on my dad's side. And this passage has to do with looking over the differences between the history of my white family and the difference to my history of my Black family. I'd only found 2 generations back on my white side, with some probability of bloodlines in Britain. What I found was that my discovered whiteness, adopted and related, was so much more privileged and freer than I or my Black family began with. My maternal grandmother was raised by a striving craftsman who chose to immigrate to America for a better life, plying his trade freely in the late 1800s, while my Black sharecropper great-grandmother was being raped by a plantation white man. My paternal grandfather, Lewis, was a self-made electrician hired to help wire up the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And his grandfather was a banker born in 1852, when my Black people were slaves. My grandfather, Henry, grew up in a fancy home where his parents' status made them think they could look down on other whites, while my Black father feared clan violence by all classes of whites. Yet the kind of opportunity privilege my white people had didn't flow to me through my mother. She gave it all up for the love of a Black man, and I was raised never knowing what that meant. So this passage I feel is important to talk about in terms of today's economic disparities.
Sure.
Because what we see is the cumulative lack of opportunity to accumulate anything by Black people through slavery, Jim Crow, and racism, while white people have been for generations upon generations building wealth. And one unfortunate thing that many Americans don't know is that after World War II, the very famous GI Bill, which gave people an opportunity to get a college education and an FHA loan on a house, was not extended to Black GIs. So the government colluded all along the way with legalized slavery, Jim Crow laws, anti-miscegenation, and denial of the rights of the GI Bill, so that we come to today, and the Boston Globe had done an article on racism here in Boston a few years back, where they identified the average net worth of a Black American family in Boston as $8. Yes, $8. While the average net worth of a white Boston family was over $245,000. And how we got to that is depicted in the 2 lines of my family.
For sure. Just to let people know that we're probably going to be wrapping up in around 5 or 10 minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and put those in the Q&A so we can get to those before we wrap up. That gets me to sort of what I wanted to ask you about, sort of, how you feel about the outlook for mixed race people, for Black people in the US right now. In looking ahead, I have days where I'm really hopeful, and sort of perversely in the days after George Floyd was murdered, seeing the uprising around the country, I was very hopeful that we were maybe reaching a tipping point. But then what I viewed as kind of a lack of meaningful action on the part of large corporations and municipal governments in the wake of that made me very despondent again. And so I go back and forth in terms of where I think we are and where we're headed. But what's your outlook, Dolores?
Calvin, I feel like the arc is moving forward, and it's a very long story. It started 400 years ago, and we aren't there yet. Mm-hmm. But if you look at mixed race, I think it's really one hopeful point in the picture, mm-hmm. because I've given you the history of how there weren't very many mixed race people back in the 40s. But today, having worked with some Census Bureau statistics, they reported in 2010 at the close of the census count, that the growth rate in mixed race births outstripped the growth rate in single race births by 3 to 1.
Wow.
And they've got some trend lines showing the growth of that demographic, and it's accelerating. Like, it's not inching along, it's not flat, but now in America, we have 1 out of 10 marriages are mixed race, according to Pew Research Center. That was in 2015. And the projections of all of those organizations is that by mid-century, this country will be 20% mixed race. That means all races marrying all races, not just black and white.
Sure.
And so when people can, like yourself or my parents, can choose their partner in life, the one that they're going to build a family with and trust with all of their most important feelings and needs and goals across the racial divide, then they are showing us how much love can overcome race. And I think that's the hopeful note in this story, even though there's a lot of racism, a lot of angst.
Mm-hmm.
Even when my mom's family reunited, her white family opened their arms because they realized that family was more important than race. And they embraced her and all of us, and we embraced them. Finally, we stopped asking, are they being honest with us? Is this really how they feel? We stopped that and crossed over into a unified family. So I think that hope is part of the long arc the march that we're on in America.
That's great. I just have one more question, and then I'll turn it back to Alex at Skylark. I wanted to talk to you about the writing of the book, because I didn't realize at first that you sort of had the idea for the book before you were a writer, because it's written so vividly and naturally that I just assumed you'd been a writer for many years. But when you I think you said to me that you wrote a draft of the story and you gave it to someone and they said, Dolores, this reads like you've written a business report. That was your first draft, right?
That's a true story, Calvin.
So how did you get from a business report to this amazing book that we have in front of us?
Thank you for the compliments on the writing. But, I didn't know anything about creative writing. I was a business person for 40 years, and the whole goal in business is to do it right, but do it yesterday. And so if you've got the facts and the recommendations included in there, you're good to go. And so I approached it the same way. I thought, I'm going to write this story. And I just sat down and wrote it, like how I got all the stuff in there I wanted. And somebody suggested to me, but you should have somebody in creative writing, maybe a teacher, look at it.
Yeah.
And that's what she said. What you have here is a business report, and you need to learn how to write creative writing. You don't have a clue. This is not a story, So actually what I did was I took some classes, and luckily in Boston, we have Grub Street, which is a creative writing center par excellence. And I learned to write there. And I started writing essays, and you can see my published essays on my website at edoloresjohnson.com. And then I just took the techniques of fiction, which I learned in some classes, dialogue, scenes, description, and so on, and applied it to the true story. I did a lot of research for Say I'm Dead. I did a lot of interviews. I did some field trips to see places, to read law, to talk to history professors, and all of that went into writing Say I'm Dead. So I want to say thank you to you, Calvin, for talking with me tonight, and urge everyone to read your book as well.
Oh, thanks.
I think that Calvin has a remarkable story too. And I really appreciate you interviewing me, and thanks again to Skylark Bookstore.
Thanks.
And thank you. That was a wonderful discussion. I think everyone was completely gripped by it. I know I certainly was. And I was so happy to hear you shout out Grub Street. I have lots of friends who teach there, and it's an amazing, wonderful writers.
You take classes online now it's because they're almost completely online. So if wherever you are in the world, if you want to take a class at Grub Street, go for it.
There you go. I had a question. I was curious as to whether you had read Britt Bennett's novel, The Vanishing Half.
I have.
Yeah, what did because I was curious about that, and because when you were talking about somebody in the supermarket making these, looking at you and making these assumptions about you, and of course in that book there are these light-skinned African American twins, and one of them chooses to present as a white person, and I was just curious what you thought of the book and whether it rang true to you, or I was just.
Well, what was so very familiar to me in that book was Louisiana. It was set in Louisiana, and there are a lot of very, very light African Americans in southern Louisiana who call themselves Frenchmen, and their last names are Thibodeau and Decuir and Fontenot and all this. So they do very much cling to their French heritage, that French side of them, and they only marry each other, just as that town that Britt Bennett brought to life. I once went to a wedding down there, and it was two Frenchmen getting married, and they had a huge reception, hundreds of people, and I may have been the darkest one there. And of course, you know, the whole idea of passing for white has always been a part of the mixed race experience in America. If people want to read some really insightful accounts of that, they should read Nella Larson, Passing and Quicksand. Some Harlem Renaissance. Sorry?
Sorry, I'm echoing a little bit. I said I read Quicksand in college.
Yeah.
It's a great book.
So I would think Britt Bennett had a little fun with that, because she took the sister who was passing for white and really messed with her, you know, by having the Black people move across the street and having her be torn. But yes, there's a lot familiar in that book.
Yeah, it's a great book, and I enjoyed it too. And I loved your message of hope at the end. I was going to ask you about that too, but you got there first. And the idea that love can overcome all of these things is, I think, perhaps a good note on which to end this wonderful, wonderful evening. So Calvin and Dolores, thank you both very, very much. We do love to put on these events, but we really can't do so without your support. So please, again, do consider buying a copy of both Calvin and Dolores's book from us at Skylark. Also want to let you know that next Wednesday we have a very special event with New York Times bestselling author and Skylark alum Wright Thompson, who will be here to talk about his wonderful new book, Pappyland. Like all Skylark events, it is free, but unlike most Skylark events, you do have to purchase a copy of the book to get the special secret code to attend. You can blame the publishers for that one. And then the following night, we have another event, which is a poetry reading with our friends from Percy Books, which features three fabulous poets, all of whom have new collections out, and that is on Thursday night. So both of those events will be just as engaging, I think, as this one. So thank you again very much, Calvin and Dolores. This was an absolutely scintillating and fascinating discussion. Very grateful for your time. Thank you again. And thanks everyone for watching, and we will see you all soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.